Is Dr. Greg Moore. He's an expert on trees and stressed urban environments, which we're all concerned about at the moment, and he's Vice President of the Sustainable Gardening Australia. Please welcome Greg.
Good evening, everyone. I was at Horsham on Tuesday, and I can commend the golf course, but give it a few months because, as most of you probably know, it was completely burnt the weekend before last. Now, I'm here as a so-called expert on urban trees and landscapes, and I'll own up to the charge. And I have a terrible confession to make. Trees, turf and landscapes use water. I'm sorry about that. And what a rotten thing for them to do during a chronic drought. Better than most, I understand the importance and real value of water. So I fully support the effective and efficient use of water. I love the use of irrigation under mulch from little drippers and leaky pipe. I support the early morning irrigation regimes because they make sound biological and environmental sense. And I do not want to go back to the good old days of profligate water use and emerald green lawns because our environment simply cannot sustain them. But let us consider a few facts. 10 years ago, parks and gardens and ovals, largely consisting of that now notorious villain, turf, used about 12% of the state's water. Today, the figure is 9%, a 25% reduction. That is a dramatic reduction. And the law of diminishing returns tells us that you can squeeze all you like, but you're not going to get very much from that sector by squeezing harder. So, at great expense, I've bought a prop. Here's the lemon that represents horticulture, parks and gardens, and I squeeze it. And I've squeezed out a good part of it. And we want a bit more. I can squeeze all I like, I'm not going to get much. That's the simple truth. So all I want to ask about is, what about the other 90%? I'll give it a little squeeze. I'll give it a bit more. Bugger me, I'm getting a cup. Give it a bit more. I want them to have a 25% cut and see how it goes and ask whether we're better off. I'm simply saying we've got to look at this situation in the big picture. Now, urban landscapes and trees have been wonderful silent assets of our society for decades and in some cases even centuries. And I'm worried that if we manage our urban trees and landscapes only through the prism of water, we get a distorted view. If I take this bottle of water and I look at you lot, God, I'm positively handsome. And my legendary dress sense has stood me in good stead in front of a large audience. I'm sorry about that. I think we've got to take a much broader view. We've got to execute a proper cost-benefit analysis of the situation in relation to our trees, our urban landscapes, our parks and gardens. I maintain that they are assets in every sense of the word and that we need to expend resources on them to manage them properly as assets. And what sort of resources, I hear you ask? I'm talking about labour, energy, and yes, even water. I can almost hear the gasps. Not water in a time of drought. Surely there are better things to use our valuable water on. We've already heard of many of them. Drinking water, of course. Hygiene, health, safe food. We all want that. But have you forgotten the benefits that the urban landscapes and trees provide if they are properly managed? Now, I want to ask you some questions. What is the value of the shade of the trees that drop temperatures by up to 8 degrees centigrade in our cities, reduce air conditioning use and reduce carbon emissions? The savings are said to be between 12 and 15%. A few trees around houses, 3 trees of about 25 metres, can provide up to $83 of annual saving in terms of your air conditioning. And we just heard Lauren say that under climate change, we're going to have maybe 3 to 5% less water. It's going to come in greater storms. And we know that the Melbourne stormwater system and the state stormwater system is not large enough to cope. There's going to be flooding. So what's the value of the trees that hold the water and absorb the water for flood reduction? Now, of course, we've got a little problem because engineers, by and large, have spent nearly 30 years making sure that no water that hits an urban street gets to a tree. You've got concrete lined wall to wall. We've got to rethink. But do we know the actual value that that's provided? Of course we don't. What's the value of reduced wind speeds? The average estimate is about 10% reduction in wind speed. Now, you may recall that in 2005 and as recently as last April, we had storms. And you probably heard people go, oh, well, it was a 1 in 30-year storm and the other one was a 1 in 100-year storm. And we opted out. We said we don't have to worry about that because they only happen very rarely. Well, not under this scenario, they don't. They're the twice a year and once a year sorts of storms. And what did we learn from them? Nothing. We didn't learn anything. We didn't say, should we be undergrounding because our electricity supply because people were without power for 3 days? We didn't do it. We said, oh no, it's an act of God. It only happens every 30 years or 100 years, so we won't learn from it at all. How bizarre. How bizarre. What's the value of our trees and landscapes in terms of pollution reduction? In 1994 in New York, its 11 million trees fixed up about 10 million US of urban pollution. What do our trees do for us in Melbourne? And you know the answer. We haven't got a clue because no one's done the work. No one's funded the research. But we have got one study, and it was quoted in the paper this morning, but they forgot one little line, as they sometimes do. Great article, but one little line. In Adelaide, they've worked out that street trees provide a minimum of $200 of value per annum for each tree. $200 of value per annum. Melbourne City Council has got about 70,000 trees. At that alone, that's $14 million a year. Now, I'm not saying the trees are worth that. They're worth a lot more. I'm just saying each year they return a minimum of $14 million. Okay? If you had a $14 million asset, would you be going, well, I just think I'll let it fall apart and die? You probably wouldn't, but you are, because the statement that Helen made at the beginning of the day that politicians reflect what we want is never a truer word. So we're letting people get away with this. This is what they've decided, this is what you get. So if we lose our urban trees and landscapes, and we don't think they're worthy of some of the resources, we could pay a very high price for this indeed. Because in that old Joni Mitchell song, you won't know what you've lost till it's gone. You only recognise that you're in a sea change looking back. You never see it coming. Now, I could go on about the benefits of trees for hours. Okay, I can see, days or weeks. I haven't even mentioned how gardens improve human health, extend human life, reduce violence and vandalism, lower blood pressure and save a truckload on medical and social infrastructure costs, because I know you all know about those and I don't need to go on any further, so I won't mention them at all. And isn't it lucky that as we let the turf in our parks and ovals die, we don't have a problem with kids lacking exercise and getting obese? Because if we did, we might really be paying a much, much higher price than we ever dreamed possible by ignoring our urban trees and landscapes. Natural turf is a much more sustainable option if you consider the big picture. Once you consider its fossil fuel chemical origins and the amount of embedded energy, rarely will artificial turf come out on top unless you're harvesting the water. Most people don't do that. In a small backyard, 8 by 4, artificial turf was put down by the owner, cost of $6,000. Why? The owner knew that they were getting older and they'd heard that lawn is not good in terms of water or the environment. So they bought artificial turf. They installed it. The purchase price of a locally made 5,000 litre tank that would have kept that little patch of green all year, $1,200. And the owner is already missing the magpies and other birds that were frequent fossicers in her lawn. So when we see this sort of bigger picture, you may ask, well, is this all there is? Is there anything else that we could talk about? And I think there is. Now, just for the ooh-ah effect, in my hand, I have a fossil. You may see the plant. It's 300 million years old. And why have I got the fossil? Because it reminds me, tangibly, that plants have changed this planet, not once, not twice, but many times in the last 4 billion years. The petrol and the fossil fuels that you use come from these plants that were fossilised the best part of 300 million years ago. If you've never seen a real fossil and you want to have a look at this one at the end of today, I'll be around. Just form a queue. Now, the question that I'm going to finish on is, I've hardly talked about climate change. Well, I don't need to, because there are 3 other speakers that are doing so. But I know that as Victorians, you've been feeling guilty about your use of water, particularly for parks and gardens. And I've been trying to say to you, don't feel guilty. Understand the benefits and the value. But more importantly, if you want an added bit of fuel in this particular debate, how much carbon is there in the trees of the city of Melbourne? 70,000 trees, let's round it off by the council, 30,000 in private gardens, 100,000 trees, 10,000 tonnes of carbon. If they die, where does the carbon go? Well, blow me down, it goes up into the atmosphere, it adds to the greenhouse effect and makes climate change worse. So I would like to think that you now have some insights into the value of urban trees, landscapes. This is not a debate about trees taking water from drinking, or trees taking water from hygiene, or even trees taking water from industry. It's about using a valuable resource sustainably and effectively to capture the maximum benefits, including the environmental benefits that make our cities, our state, and our nation livable.
Thank you very much, Greg. That was really wonderful. Dr. Lauren Rickard is a Senior Associate with RMCG Consulting. She knows a lot about drought and the effect of drought on rural communities. Please welcome Lauren.
I think it's perhaps appropriate that we start with the topic of agriculture, because the greatest impact that any of us have on water resources is via the food we put in our mouths. Compared to the 11% that each household uses in washing, cleaning and gardening, approximately half of our water footprint is contained in the food we consume. Now, I'm sure that all of us could reduce the food we consume a little, and we could certainly reduce the 40% that gets thrown away. But at the end of the day, besides drinking water, eating food is the least optional of our water-consuming activities. So the question is, how can we reduce its impact? It's a matter of engaging and supporting the agricultural sector in the tough, painful and altogether necessary process of change that has already begun. This evening I want to facilitate that engagement and support by providing an overview of the importance and challenges of modern agriculture and its relationship to water. I want to bring agriculture home to all of us as an issue that's not out there, some dusty, distant industry populated by irreverent irrigators and cowboys, but an issue that is very much personal, indeed embodied, for each of us in this room. As you will have observed in some readings of the water crisis, agriculture is positioned as a greedy, backwards, and altogether unwelcome user of our water resources, competing unfairly with the environment and urban dwellers for a disproportionate share of the water available. Well, there is some truth in this reading. In Australia, agriculture uses 70% of the water consumed each year. But before we get angry at industry for exploiting the environment and dehydrating cities, we need to consider what this particular industry uses the water for. It's not a use that can be easily dismissed. Indeed, it is one of heightening importance. That is feeding and in some cases clothing us and millions of others in the world. Now, talk of feeding the world may seem naively altruistic and altogether somewhat retro. It's undeniably the case that agriculture is a commercial activity in which some people reap large profits. But many farmers do what they do for comparably and increasingly little financial reward, which is one of the reasons that the number of people doing it is plummeting. Feeding the world is also a phrase that does bring back echoes of alarmist warnings in the 70s about world hunger, not to mention images of Bob Geldof and friends singing Band-Aid hits in unison. But it is very much a modern issue. While some seem to believe hunger is now only a problem for a few war-torn African nations, the problem of feeding people is a serious issue for a growing number of countries. Worsened by ongoing problems with the distribution of food, overall food production is going to have to more than double in the next 40 years. Because by 2050, there's going to be 9.3 billion of us on this planet, and we're going to be eating the equivalent of 13 billion people by today's standards due to improvements in nutritional status and new dietary trends, namely meat consumption. With this kind of pressure, lifting food production is going to be central to global stability. Since the 1990s, 2/3 of all conflicts around the world have been driven in part by shortage of food, land or water. If global food production slips further, the number of conflicts, not to mention refugees, will increase dramatically. Combined with the costs and risks of importing food, including the concept of food miles, domestic food production and supply is a growing priority in many countries, including Australia. Already some developing countries are banning the export of key food products like rice in order to secure their domestic supply. Meanwhile, countries that can continue to afford to export, like Australia, are gaining an increasing role as a food basket in an ever hungrier world. The upshot of this global context is that it's not rational for any of us to take an antagonistic approach to the agricultural industry, no matter how much we know it needs to improve. Food isn't the only reason we should take an interest in agriculture and its role in the water crisis either. Besides food producers, agriculturalists are land managers. Approximately 60% of Australia's land area is used for farming and pastoralism. How this vast area of land is managed is of national importance. It affects our biodiversity, our climate, and, of course, our water. Well-managed agricultural land can play a crucial role in good catchment management, with healthy soil and plants providing a vital water storage and filtering service. Likewise, poorly managed agricultural land can lead to a host of water problems, from salinisation, acidification, eutrophication and pollution, to over-extraction, leaching, riparian zone damage and erosion. The point is that whether done well or badly, agriculturalists are some of our nation's most influential water managers. For this reason alone, we need to support them. To date, farmers are generally not financially compensated or rewarded, for example, for making the effort to manage their environmental resources above a minimum standard. So in contrast to the view that agriculture is antiquated and an inappropriate use of resources, the sector is one that at a global and national level and from a food and land management perspective deserves our support. and support it certainly needs. For vast and urgent improvements are required, none the least in the area of water management. Our current generation of farmers has inherited a legacy of degraded resources, which is challenging enough to overcome in prosperous times, let alone at the moment. By 2050, the amount of water available for agriculture will have dropped by a third as cities consume half of the world's water. For farmers to double their production, as I mentioned they're being called upon to do, they are therefore going to have to lift their water use efficiency by 200%. An alternative is to switch to dryland agriculture, that is, agriculture fed by rain rather than irrigation. One of the reasons that Australian food production is of importance for the globe is that we're leaders in dryland agriculture. We are therefore prepared to an extent for the challenge of receiving a smaller proportion of the global water pie. Yet, as we are all aware, the size of the pie is also shrinking, at least in southern Australia where we produce most of our food. As you'll know, climate change is projected to decrease our annual rainfall by 2 to 5% and increase temperatures by around 1 degree. Importantly, the projected rainfall declines are worst in the pasture and crop growing periods of winter and spring, and the rain that does fall will be in more intense and less frequent bursts, making it altogether less useful for plant growth. The frequency and intensity of droughts and heat waves is, of course, also predicted to increase. So overall, the result is that average productivity on many dryland farms will fall, and some farms and whole regions will no longer be able to produce the amount of food they currently do, let alone actually double production. Some areas are already being closed down completely. Let me pause now and share with you some insights into what it's like for farming families to actually live with water shortages, because they are the first to suffer from water scarcity relative to us pampered urban dwellers. And such scarcity, of course, has much greater implications for them as well. Over the last couple of years, I've been doing some work with the community farmer organisation, the Birchip Cropping Group, in the dryland and cropping area of the Wimmera Southern Mallee in northwest Victoria. We've conducted hundreds of hours of in-depth interviews with randomly selected farming families to better understand how drought is impacting them. What they are telling us has brought home how difficult living and working with water shortage is, not only at a technical or business level, but at a personal, family and community level. While there are, of course, farms and farming families that are doing well, a growing number are running out of financial, physical and personal reserves. Combined with the many other stresses they are under, from declining terms of trade and the economic crisis to increasing planning restrictions and biosecurity protocols, for example, living with what has been 10 to 15 years of dryness for some areas is about a lot more than failed crops and skinny sheep. It's about losing your neighbours, your friends and your family and your employees to the mines, the cities and foreclosure. It's about losing your local shops, your services, your schools and your sports clubs. It's about growing isolation, having no water in the house and worrying about your children. It's about not being able to sleep, to talk, to move because of the stress and uncertainty. It's about hearing new ideas you know you should try, but not having the money, the time, the energy, the know-how or the courage to give them a go. As some interviewees said about their situation, I just felt like we were in deep enough before the drought hit, and the impact of drought on top of that, well, everything is caught up. Whereas in other years it was bad, it was usually only one problem at a time. If I believed in God, I would just be praying. That's how it is. I find it very difficult to think about this coming year without feeling just absolute panic. It's clear that things need to change, and farming families above all know this. But the rules of thumb that many have farmed by for years no longer seem to apply, and there is confusion about what good farming actually now looks like. As an interviewer explained, they have spent most of their farming life following a set of rules which don't work anymore. Combined with the fact that they don't have the resources to implement the changes needed, information is badly needed on how to manage a farm well under water scarcity in Australia. These stories are from dryland farmers, but what about irrigators, those who use 90% of the water consumed by agriculture? Well, the story is equally bad, if not worse. Until recently, irrigation was considered a safety net. Akin to our situation in the cities, The rainfall on one's property might drop. Indeed, it may never be at a viable level in the first place. But because one is able to access water from elsewhere, such local water shortage has never been a problem. But the current drought for irrigators is a double drought. Its unprecedented geographic extent has shocked them by drying up not only their farm downs, but the distant water catchments on which their livelihoods rely. One of the problems for them is that the soil in our water catchments is now so dry that a large proportion of the rain that does fall is taken up saturating the soil. It doesn't convert to free-flowing water we can use. Due in part to this and the necessary corrections that are taking place to previous over-allocation of water, it's predicted that the Murray-Darling Basin, which is where 40% of Australia's agricultural produce is grown, is going to drop in value. The irrigated agriculture will drop in value by a whopping 92% by the year 2100. Some updates on the region from the Horticulture Water Initiative give insight into what's happening. They state, harvest has been disappointingly low in many tree and vine crops. The general feeling in the districts is one of anxiety. Growers are starting to see areas of vacant land as vines and trees are cleared. Hope is diminishing and the stress and anger in the irrigation community is immense. It's important to note that we're talking about some of the world's leading irrigators. Australian irrigators are extremely efficient at turning water into food and fibre. Not only does this give us a leadership role in the world that we need to take seriously, but it means that the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, have already been picked. Now we need some serious innovation and rethinking. Fortunately, there are some ingenious and inspiring examples of such change already occurring. Unfortunately, I'm not able to go into them tonight. But the point I want to emphasise is that serious barriers to change exist and require our encouragement and support. Because not only is food central to our well-being, but we, as consumers and fellow citizens, are central to farming families' well-being and their associated ability to improve the way they use water to produce the food we consume and to manage environmental resources on our behalf. So what can we do to help? Well, there's a lot of things. Think about what you eat, what you drink. What embedded water are you consuming? How much water was taken to produce it, to store it, to transport it? What message are you sending to the market? Be prepared to pay for food products that come with strong environmental benefits and call on the government to reward farmers for the ecosystem services that their farm management provides or could provide. Buy Australian, support agriculture in your local area. Do what you can to support rural communities that underpin our farming populations. Have your next holiday in Horsham. Harvest your own water and support water recycling in order to free up water for alternative uses, including agriculture. Don't fall into the irrigator's trap of relying only on some distant and seemingly bottomless water catchment. Call on government to fund more research, development and extension in agriculture and water management. Call on them to be open to new and perhaps radical ideas. Call on them to develop a population policy for Australia to help developing countries manage their population growth and to work with groups around the world to progress sustainable agriculture. Above all, recognise the increasing importance of agriculture, the serious challenges our farming families face in water management, and the voter and consumer support the sector needs in order to change as it must do. Whether we like it or not, agriculture is and will remain a large part of our water footprint, but with a spirit of collaboration, we can help to reduce its size.